So my name is Freya, and I am the executive director of Sigurd Olson's Listening Point Foundation. I am so grateful that you're all here to listen to me talk about Sigurd and his work and his legacy, but first I'm going to talk about me. I believe that most of you here are familiar with Sigurd Olson, who he was, why we're still talking about him today, but I'm going to take a few minutes to tell you a different story, one that also roots deep into the woods and waters of northern Minnesota. It is not evident at first glance why I, a young woman from Poughkeepsie, New York, am up here today representing Sigurd, but it all starts far, far long ago when I was a very little girl, and my late grandfather, Bill Cunningham, was a professor of biology at the University of Minnesota. He was a teacher through and through, always ready with an explanation for anything, and if he didn't know the answer to a question, he'd respond with his motto, often in error, never in doubt. When I was a kid, I was certain that my grandpa knew pretty much everything there was to know in the world. Because my family had always been close, we would spend every break from school in Minnesota with our extended family. We'd often vacation up at YMCA Camp de Nord, and those weeks spent in the woods of Ely were magical for me. I was a child who was plagued with anxiety from a very early age, and here I could disappear into the trees with my grandpa while the rest of my cousins were off at age group and playing organized sports. I'd hike with him and we'd go fishing, and as we did, he would tell me about Sigurd Olson. I never retained very much, but I liked to hear the stories. Grandpa was a lecturer at heart, and I believed he hoped to find an eager and attentive audience in his 7 grandchildren, but all of us were under 10 and extremely unwilling. Why would we want to listen to Grandpa lecture when we'd rather be outside? He never stopped trying though, and in one summer in 2014, he brought a few of us out to Listening Point. It was there that I met David Backus, Sigurd's biographer, for the first time. I have no idea if my grandpa coordinated this meeting with David or how it all worked out, but over the course of the afternoon between David and my grandpa, I received the most thorough explanation of Sigurd Olson that I have ever and will ever hear. I wish I could remember more of it. Life happened and I grew up, my attention turning to high school and how apocalyptic life can feel when you're 17. But my grandpa and I always remained very close, and I always had a copy of Runes of the North on my bookshelf. I went to college at College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine. In order to complete my degree, I had to also complete an in-person internship, and I contacted the Listening Point Foundation and became their very first intern in the summer of 2020. My grandfather had passed away in 2019. It was unexpected and devastating, and I would spend the long afternoons of my internship out at the point, envisioning the conversations that we would be having if you were there with me. I completed the internship, and then my college years wrapped up as well, and then I contacted the foundation asking if there was any way I could continue to be involved. They said yes. I moved to Ely in June of 2021, taking on the role of the foundation's programming director, and in October of 2023, I stepped into the position of executive director. I honestly never expected that this was the path that my life would take, but looking back, it's easy to see all of the pieces falling into place. I am proud to carry Sigurd Olson's legacy, and I carry Bill Cunningham's legacy as well, and hope that I can honor their teachings with you here today. Here is a photo of Bill and I in the Coetico when I was very young. He is lecturing me about something there, and clearly I'm listening very attentively. So, who was Sigurd Olson? When we think of Sigurd today, many of us think of one of two things. We think of Sigurd the advocate, who lent his voice to a quiet land in an effort to save the wilderness. Or we think of Sigurd the author, who wrote 9 books about love of land, history, and inspiration of spirit. Sigurd Olson was both of these things and more. He was a teacher, a philosopher, a conservationist, but more than anything, he was a champion of public lands and their creation and protection. He was born on April 4th, 1899 in Chicago, Illinois, to parents who had just immigrated over from Sweden. The family soon moved to northern Wisconsin, where Sigurd began to hone in his love of wilderness and solitude. In August of 1920, Sigurd married Norwegian farmer's daughter, Elizabeth Dorothy Ehrenholt, and the two would have two sons, Sigurd Thorn, who was born in 1923, and Robert Bobby Olson, who was born in 1925. With parents like Sigurd and Elizabeth, it was no surprise that the boys had a childhood full of adventure. Sigurd led many canoe trips over his life with his family and then with friends and also with government officials, leading each group with the same infectious energy, drive, and passion, inspiring his comrades to think of the land not as something to conquer, but something to love and understand. When he wasn't out leading trips, he was teaching biology and ecology at the Ely High School and junior college. Sigurd, or Professor Olson to his students, was much beloved inside and out of the classroom, but as much as he enjoyed his work, Sigurd was feeling unfulfilled. He had known from a very young age that he had one purpose for existing, and that was to spread some message through the written word. This mindset led to him fusing his two passions, taking his philosophical view of the wilderness and our integral place in it as humans, and writing personal, emotional essays that distilled these great concepts and made them easy for anyone to understand and relate to. It would take many years of struggling for Sigurd to get published, as the popular nature stories of the day were the hook and bullet stories, stories of hunting triumph and defeat. Sigurd found that he did not like to write in this style and began to create his own voice, one that was lyrical and at times almost poetic. He'd focus on connectivity to land and the betterment of the human condition, but the publishing houses still viewed his content as too soft, and so he wouldn't get published until 1956. And first, he had some more life to live. When World War II broke out, Sigurd spent a year in Europe teaching the GIs waiting to be sent back home to the US. He served as an official advisor to the Nuremberg trials before heading back home to Ely, where he announced to Elizabeth his intention to retire and dedicate his time to writing. In 1956, Sigurd purchased 30 acres of land on Burnside Lake from Mrs. Edith White for about $4,000, paid in increments over several years. The property would become Listening Point, Sigurd's safe haven and muse. As he wrote, "Listening Point is a bare glaciated spit of rock in the Quetico Superior Country. Each time I have gone there, I have found something new, which has opened up great realms of thought and interest. For me, it has been a point of discovery and, like all such places of departure, has assumed meaning far beyond the ordinary. From it, I have seen the immensity of space and glimpsed at times the grandeur of creation. There, I have sensed the span of uncounted centuries and looked down the path all life has come. I have explored on this rocky bit of shore the great concept that nothing stands alone and everything, no matter how small, is part of a greater whole." This space was his link to the far Northland, as his health began to limit his far-flung excursions. His values are evident in every aspect of the property, from the simple winding trails to the buildings tucked back in the woods, hidden from the shoreline. He named the point Listening Point because only when one comes to listen, only when one is aware and still, can things be seen and heard. Everyone has a listening point somewhere. It does not have to be in the north or close to the wilderness, but someplace of quiet where the universe can be contemplated with awe. The property was undeveloped when Sigurd purchased it, and he set about populating the space with basic structures: a sauna, a cabin, a biffy, and 2 small woodsheds. So I know some of you know this story already, but can anyone here tell me what the building was that would eventually become Sigurd Olson's cabin? Does anybody know the history? No? Sigurd Olson's cabin started its life with very humble beginnings as a chicken coop out on a farm near the Ely airport. Sigurd Olson was a great many things, but a handyman was not one of them. And since he had a great love of tradition and finished building, he would drive around Ely and the surrounding towns searching for shacks that he could purchase and relocate. The coop was deconstructed in 1956. Its tamarack logs dragged across the ice of Burnside, and in the spring of '57, a crew of local builders built the iconic Listening Point cabin. That cabin would be a symbol of a way of life, an extension of an ideal that was all involved with Listening Point. Sigurd's cabin was simple, with no running water or electricity, but with huge windows on all sides looking out through the trees to Burnside Lake and a great boulder, a glacial erratic, protecting the cabin from the winter winds and serving as a playground for the red squirrels that Sigurd adored. Listening Point would become the inspiration for all of Sigurd's books, but he never wrote out there. He had intended to at first, bringing with him his notebooks and pencils, sometimes even his portable but still quite heavy typewriter. He quickly determined that the point was far too distracting of a location to get much work done. Why should he write when he could fish or swim or even just sit quietly and listen to the world around him? Sigurd started to mentally collect the aspects that made Listening Point the perfect place. He'd note the reflection of the sun on the water, and the ghostly calling of the loons, the rich smell of sun-warmed pine needles deep in the summer, and he'd take these things back with him to his writing shack, a converted one-car garage in the front yard of their home that served as his office. In the shack, he'd pour all those collected thoughts and memories onto the page, and he'd set about crafting his books. In 1956, the same year that the cabin was completed, Sigurd would finally publish his first essay collection, The Singing Wilderness. The Singing Wilderness has to do with the calling of the loons, northern lights, and great silences of a land lying northwest of Lake Superior. It is concerned with the simple joys, the timelessness and perspective found in a way of life that is close to the past. I have heard the singing in many places, but I seem to hear it best in the wilderness lake country of the Connecticut Superior, where travel is still by pack and canoe over ancient trails of Indians and voyageurs. I have heard it on misty migration nights when the dark has been alive with the high calling of birds, and in rapids when the air has been full of their rushing thunder. I have caught it at dawn when the mists were moving out of the bays, and on cold winter nights when the stars seem close enough to touch. But the music can even be heard in the soft guttering of an open fire, or in the beat of rain on a tent, and sometimes not until long afterward, when, like an echo out of the past, you know it was there in some quiet place, or when you were doing something simple in the out of doors. The Singing Wilderness quickly joined the New York Times bestsellers list. Sigurd would go on to publish 8 more books, all exploring the importance of the natural world to the human spirit and our role in protecting it. As he encouraged his readers to protect wild spaces, he was also traveling all around the country, lecturing to crowds and politicians about the importance of land preservation. He put his own safety at risk after many of these lectures. He'd have to have bodyguards escort him out past the people waiting to attack him outside. In 1977, Sigurd and Bud Heinzelman, another prominent Ely environmentalist, were hung in effigy off of logging trucks in front of the Ely City Hall. Sigurd was traveling back and forth between Ely and Washington, D.C., lobbying for keeping land undeveloped and ecologically sound. No issue is a simple one, and Sigurd's stance set him at odds with his neighbors in the Ely community. Although there was pushback against the policies he was supporting and violence enacted against him, he remained steadfast in his work to preserve the land he loved so much, aiming to keep it wild and growing so that all might enjoy the experience of an untrammeled wilderness for exploring, hunting, fishing, hiking, and simply being out in. Sigurd's influence on government was aided with his important roles in many national wilderness organizations. He served as the president of the National Parks Association and Wilderness Society. In 1963, he became a consultant on wilderness and national park matters as Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udell. Sigurd understood the need for balance. You can't convince people to protect things they aren't already excited about, and so he moved to protect as many public lands as possible, keeping them protected and accessible for all of us today. Here in Minnesota, we know Sigurd for the Boundary Waters, but he was involved in so much more than that. He was responsible for the Cascades National Park in Washington State, Maine's Allagash waterways, the Cape Cod seashore, Yellowstone, the Grand Tetons, the Everglades, and others. Lacey is passing out a few copies of this map if anyone wants a closer look. I know it's a little hard to read. This long list meant that Sigurd had more tangible influence than any of his contemporaries. From Thoreau to Kimmerer, Leopold to Burroughs, Sigurd Olson preserved more land. And I'm not trying to diminish these incredible accomplishments of these wonderful writers and teachers. They were all key players in US environmental history, but they were remembered where Sigurd Olson was forgotten. The general public doesn't know about Sigurd like they do Henry David Thoreau or Aldo Leopold. Sigurd Olson really isn't taught in schools. His name isn't plastered on every national park sign you've seen. His influence was mighty, far-reaching, but quiet. His work has continued to appeal to quiet people, the ones who prefer the solitude of the wilderness to the chaos of real life and civilization. Those who know Sigurd's teachings know them well, and they know them deeply. Like my grandpa passed on Sigurd's teachings to me, those who love Sigurd hand his teachings on to others, inspiring them to keep the words alive long after their writer had passed. Sigurd Olson died on January 13th, 1982. He and Elizabeth had each gifted each other a brand new pair of snowshoes for the holidays, and that fateful morning was their first opportunity they had to try them out. The Olsons left the house in the mid-morning, out into the deep cold and pale winter sunshine. After trekking a ways, Elizabeth made the call to return home. She was cold and her bindings wouldn't stay tied, so they went their separate ways, with Sigurd heading off into the woods and Elizabeth returning to town to make them lunch. Sigurd would never come home. He'd be found some hours later, having had a heart attack and died, alone in the snow in the quiet of the woods. Ultimately, the perfect way for someone like him to reach the end of their story. In the days that followed, no one went into Sigurd's writing shack. And when they finally did, they discovered Sigurd's last message on his old typewriter. It read, "A new adventure is coming up, and I'm sure it will be a good one." Sigurd's last words rang true, as after his death, his teachings continued. Elizabeth, friends, students would speak about Sigurd and his legacy of protecting the land. Here you can see Elizabeth at Camp Widgewagon in about 1984, speaking to the next generation of canoe country lovers. Elizabeth did not want to remain in Ely after her husband's death. Her son Bob and his wife Vonnie had purchased Elizabeth's childhood homestead in Sealy, Wisconsin. And so she would move out there and live with them until she would die where she was born in 1994. The Uhrenholt family farm is now the Uhrenholt Memorial Demonstration Forest, maintained by the Wisconsin Historical Society. After Elizabeth passed, Sig Jr. and Bob were left to decide the fate of Listening Point. They were both living lives elsewhere, Bob in Wisconsin and Sig Jr. in Alaska, and rarely did they have the opportunity to return to Ely. They made the decision to start a nonprofit organization that would carry on the teachings of their father, and in 1998, the Listening Point Foundation was established. The mission of the Listening Point Foundation is dedicated to preserving Listening Point and advancing Sigurd Olson's wilderness philosophy. Listening Point was a place of connection for Sigurd, continually renewing his sense of wonder and gratitude for the natural world. A central theme throughout his written works and speeches is the idea that wilderness is important to the well-being of the human spirit. We encourage people to find their own listening point and inspire their connection to wild places. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement as well, and that is that everyone has a listening point somewhere. The Listening Point Foundation listens to, learns from, and embraces diverse and underrepresented voices as we strive to help all people find a connection through nature through the wilderness philosophy of Sigurd Olson. Today, the Listening Point Foundation is small but ever growing. We have 2 staff members, myself and the wonderful Heather, who keep everything running behind the scenes. We have a collection of passionate volunteers and board members whose drive and dedication allow us to keep bringing people out to visit Listening Point and learning the story of a defender of wilderness and an icon of Ely. We upkeep the historic buildings and provide programming such as writing and artistry workshops, service projects, and educational opportunities. In 2017, the Listening Point property was added to the National Register of Historic Places, and in 2021, Sigurd's Writing Shack was recognized as well, ensuring the lasting protection of the space for the enjoyment of future generations. If you are interested in getting involved in volunteering or visiting in any way, you're welcome to visit our website, listeningpointfoundation.org, that has all of the information you need to move ahead with that. Now, this is the really exciting thing. On September 6th, in this very room at 5 p.m., Listening Point Foundation is hosting our annual Northwoods dinner. And this year is a very special one. Not only is it our 26th dinner that we've hosted and an opportunity to gather to celebrate the coming of fall to the Northland and our beautiful Ely community, but this year is also the 60th anniversary of the passing of the 1964 Wilderness Act. I certainly hope that you will join us. Again, all of the information for registering can be found on our website. After that shameless plug, I'll leave you with one last thought. Sigurd Olson's ultimate thesis was that humans need connection to nature. We come from the earth, and to the earth we shall all one day return. And during those between years of school and laundry, making dinner and walking the dog, we have to get outside. If we lose our connection to nature, we lose everything. It is imperative to our well-being, mind, body, and soul, that we have adventures and solitude, and we get dirt on our hands, and we teach our children to do the same. We are all here in this little town for the same reason that Sigurd was, because we love the Northwoods and all that it contains. Let us all continue to carry on Sigurd's message of honoring space and history, because we are all part of a greater whole, and every single one of us has a listening point somewhere. We just have to be brave enough to find it.